Hey, U.S. History students, it's Dustin Baker again. Hope you're doing well. This is Baker's Corner. We're going to actually do another lesson that kind of transitions us from the end of World War II through basically the early 1960s. So instead of doing a lot of content on the Cold War, which we finished off with last time, we're going to take a very brief look at a couple of major developments with President Harry S. Truman and also the next president, who is going to be Dwight D Eisenhower. All right. So something to keep in mind is, first of all, guys, remember just a little bit of understanding here. Truman is going to be the president that takes over after the untimely death of Franklin D. Roosevelt in April of 1945. And so I don't know about all of you, but I like to try to put myself as best I can in the position of people when they have really big challenges. And definitely, guys, I think it's safe to say with this confidence that Truman is going to be really in an interesting position. I think it was former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, when Truman went to kind of give her consolation for her loss, and she said something along the lines, "You're the one in trouble now." So how would we feel about that, guys, knowing that World War II is still going on, that eventually he's going to make the very difficult decision to eventually use the atomic bomb against Japan. And he's going to have a lot of other challenges we already studied a little bit about with the end of Korea, et cetera. All right. So anyway, he's going to pattern a lot of his things, not all of them, but certainly a sizable number of them, in a very similar deal to the New Deal. Right. So that's why we call it this fair deal policy. He's going to try to make progress in regards to health insurance, actually an increase with things like the minimum wage, et cetera. All right. And guys, so he's going to be, I think, a really ambitious president. And he is, keep in mind, a president that will go on to serve another term. But as you can see, guys, at the top of the picture here, not a lot of people, at least some of the press, actually had confidence that Truman would be in a great position to be elected. And we'll talk more about that here in just a moment. All right. You're also going to see a lot of political clashes in the time period because, guys, I mean, national health insurance, while that's something that we hear a lot about in our modern day with, those of you that are familiar with the term Obamacare and some of the other things that we hear about, guys, and down the line, we'll even have in the 60s beyond this time period, about 20 years later, the Medicare issue popping up. The one thing, guys, that we notice is that Truman really brings the need for this to the forefront of the American public and also the Congress, right? So he's very quick to point this out in many of his speeches, formal addresses, some of his, some of the State of the Unions, and then also some of the really big pictures of just the speech, the need to do it. One of the things that he really, guys, is going to kind of clash with quite a few Republicans on, more conservative Republicans especially, is the idea of trying to downplay the idea of this being what some people refer to as socialized medicine. So he's really trying to make it clear that this is not going to be socialized medicine, that the doctors are not really going to be employed by government agencies and things like that. All right. But nonetheless, as you guys probably already know, it is a debate now, and it certainly was a big debate then as well. Okay. You are going to see the passing of an Employment Act of 1946 that, again, is going to give some greater protection to some of the working class people. And then, guys, one of the bigger things that we'll come back to in a few weeks when we study the civil rights movement, which of course we know is really important, is Truman kind of gets the ball rolling with this focus on desegregation, or what some people would also call integration of the American military. He did this in 1948. You're welcome to write that date down if you want to. But guys, at the end of the day, as you can imagine, keep in mind, this is still a hot topic. The Supreme Court has not formally ruled to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson yet. That will happen after we transition to the Eisenhower time in office. And so, guys, as you can imagine, Truman was not real popular with a good number of the people, especially in deep southern states, and even people that refer to themselves in 1948 as Democrats as the Dixiecrats. All right. People like Strom Thurmond, who at the time was a senator of the great state of South Carolina. He's actually going to kind of split the party in a sense. And guys, what you notice is if you've ever heard of the concept of political party realignment, this is really important, right? So these political parties, not to say that Truman is the architect of this, you've seen some of this happening under FDR, but guys, what are we noticing with the sizable amount of especially African-American Americans or residents, they are actually going to be moving from Republican Party to actually a stronger support for the Democratic Party. And guys, if you think about it in a lot of ways today, that trend has definitely continued. When you look at some of the numbers and some of the projections with the amount of support for that party. All right. The other thing to keep in mind, guys, is that post World War II, we are trying to reconvert our economy. Think about what that means post World War I. All right. So we're trying to go from an economy that is more based on war production to one that is obviously reverting back to the idea of consumerism, which we'll study later. There's a problem here, right? And guys, the problem is, or maybe problem is not the right word, but certainly a big concern or a dilemma is, where is the status of the United States different post World War II? Well, now we're a superpower, right? And a lot of you guys are like, well, Mr. Baker, why does that really matter with our economy? Well, that really matters when it comes to the idea of how do you balance, and we'll see what Eisenhower has said with this in a minute, guys, but how do we balance the idea of consumer production with that of a country that's going to have more responsibility around the world militarily, right? And that would mean that post World War II, guys, remember, we're in a nuclear world at this point in time. So we're going to focus a lot more on that kind of weapons. We'll look at that a little bit later in more detail, but a lot of you guys are familiar with the Cold War and the rise of the arms race between us and the Soviet Union. Okay, so how do we balance that, right? And that's tough. Eisenhower down the line says that for America, this is new, right? This is kind of unseen territory to an extent for a country that's only been really a world power and not a country that's had the responsibility historically like a country like Britain and France. But guys, keep in mind, since World War II has ended, those countries are really not in the same position to be able to uphold the same amount of responsibility. They're complimenting us, but the torch has been passed. Okay, so we're going to reconvert our economy with also a lot of continued production with the military sector. And guys, what we notice is we see a lot of new technology, a lot of similarity, by the way, to post World War I. So think, guys, post World War II being a transition back to a degree of peace, new technology with the continued rise of even, guys, the transistor radio, which I realize the radio is not new, but the idea of reducing size is definitely something that's going to continue to affect us. The television, as we'll see in future lessons. And then, guys, for here, Truman, as far as domestic things, he's going to be the first president that's actually affected by the 22nd Amendment. Now, a lot of you guys are wondering, okay, Mr. Baker, that's a number. Why is it important? Well, guys, the 22nd Amendment is going to formally create what we call term limits for the president. All right, so that's the big picture of the 22nd Amendment. This is added to our Constitution in 1951, by the way. So this is going to be preceding the end of Truman's second term. Okay, if you want to refer to his second term as a second term instead of a first full term. But guys, look at what it says here. And you can actually Google this. It's the exact same thing, guys, if you look at the Constitution. But this is exactly as it reads. It says, no person shall be elected to the office of the president more than what? Twice. And no person who has held the office of the president or acted as president. Guys, believe it or not, there's a big debate about, is acting as president the same as actually holding the office permanently? Okay, so this particular amendment is trying to actually address that to an extent. For more than 2 years of a term to which some other person was elected president shall be elected to the office of the president more than once. And it goes on to, of course, talk a little bit more. Now, why do I bring that up? Well, guys, think about it like this. How many times in American history since the era of Truman have we had two presidents that the idea of them being in office for 2 years before they left, or at least potentially would have left, apply to be able to go for more than the 8 years? And the answer is not many, right? You're going to have the successor of John F. Kennedy with a gentleman by the name of Lyndon B Johnson, LBJ for short. You're going to have the potential that Ford could have done it, although he only served a 2-year term, but he was defeated by Carter. Since then, guys, you don't really have that as an option. And in this, let me explain what this doesn't mean, guys. It doesn't mean, in my interpretation, that you run for 2 terms and you can run for a partial second or third and then step down, right? That's not really what this is talking about. All right. But LBJ was in a position to do this in the late 1960s. And just a real quick thing before we study him later, guys, in more detail, Lyndon B Johnson makes a decision, partly due to the Vietnam War, partly due to other things. He does pass away in 1973. So, it's not like his health was immediately an issue, but it was certainly a concern. And guys, what he tells the American public on live television, mind you, that he would not accept the nomination by his party for another term. All right, so he's essentially saying that I'm not going to basically push for the fulfillment of this particular thing. Why is that a big deal, guys? It's a big deal because Truman is the first president to not be in a position, if they wanted, to really move on to that other term. All right. With that being said, we have the administration of the next president, who is Dwight D Eisenhower, right? Who, by the way, is going to be the last general to serve in the office of president. All right. Now, he's going to be very much associated, guys, with what we call modern republicanism. Some people also label this as dynamic conservatism. But I want y'all to look at a quote by him to actually his brother. Now, this isn't a famous letter that was published later, so it's a private correspondence. And I want you guys to think about, okay, how does this quote really give us a little bit of insight as to how Eisenhower is going to actually have to proceed, given that he's followed, guys, get this, 20 years of Democratic Party leadership, if you include both FDR and Truman. But look at what he says. He says, should any political party attempt to abolish Social Security, unemployment insurance, and eliminate labor laws and farm programs, you would what? Not hear of that party again in our political history. So essentially, guys, can you put two and two together here and figure out what in the world is Eisenhower getting at before we look at a couple of big details? And guys, the quick version of this is that the context here is that his brother, who's a pretty conservative guy, from what I understand, was actually kind of criticizing him. Hey, you're not, really doing away with some of these previous policies that added more government, more things like that. And guys, essentially, if you think about it, what is Eisenhower responding to his brother in principle with? Basically, guys, what he's saying in a sense is twofold. Number one is that the New Deal is here to stay. Right? We are not going to be able to get rid of the New Deal. We're not going to be able to get rid of Social Security. We're not going to be able to get rid of the FDIC. Certain farm programs that require the government to be more involved in that sector. We are not going to be able to do that. Or what's the second part? It is going to be a nail in the coffin to any party that tries it. Ergo, in his case, guys, the Republican Party. Okay. Now, an interesting situation, guys, is that Eisenhower is a very popular candidate because remember, he's a World War II veteran, so he has a lot of respect. He, to my knowledge, wasn't really preferential to a party before really running at this point in time. At least that's some of the details that I have. But guys, the Republican Party nominates him. And for those of you that remember our friend, Douglas MacArthur, there was a lot of talk, guys, about even nominating him. All right. So anyway, Eisenhower runs. And in 1952, he is elected to his first of two terms. Feel free to stop the screen if you want to take a few things down here. Okay. So Eisenhower, guys, again, very popular. One of his interesting criticism, guys, is that evidently he liked to golf, which I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but evidently, guys, some of the critics were like, well, is he doing more of that than actually governing? Because he tended, I think, to pass off some things to some leadership within his cabinet, et cetera. But guys, all the evidence that I've seen seems to suggest that yes, he did tend to give some responsibility to some of his subordinates, or whatever you want to call them. But at the end of the day, guys, he was very quick in saying, okay, at the end of the day, it's my decision to make. Okay. And that included anything from some of the new look foreign policy that involved building up military armed, some of the ideas of like the arms race with especially nuclear weapons and things like that, as opposed to a larger standing army. Okay. But he runs on this interesting platform, K1C2. K1, guys, think back to what's going on still in Korea. Korean War has not ended yet. So therefore, Eisenhower is going to be a really big advocate of the idea of actually bringing about what's eventually known as an armistice, right? Which is kind of a fancy way of saying a ceasefire. Okay. And guys, believe it or not, a lot of people contend that armistice, which, by the way, keep in mind, North and South Korea are still divided today, all right, is actually something that, there's still technically, a lot of tension there, but yet the war came to some degree of an outcome. Okay. But he basically went over there, guys, in his campaign. My father-in-law, who was stationed in Korea during the Korean War, actually was in Japan as some little side, trip or whatever. And guys, when Eisenhower was over there, as you can imagine, this is before he was actually elected the first term. And guys, evidently it was such a kind of a big deal for good reason, right? He's the upcoming candidate for the party. He actually was over there, and security was very tight. All right, but he eventually did get elected. The C is going to deal with a degree of conservatism, cutting spending, stuff like that. And guys, he does successfully bring an end to that conflict, at least with the armistice. All right, he advocates what we called on the previous slide modern republicanism. So, guys, think about what that means. Okay. So, this is actually a direct quote by Eisenhower. It's short, but I think it says a lot about what he's getting at. Cutting tax, spending, and taxes. Okay. Well, his argument is that if we're going to really have sustained economic growth, sustained meaning over the long term and not kind of like a roller coaster ride, but it's going to lead to a lot of issues. He does contend, guys, that we want to be able to have a balanced budget, which, by the way, he is able to do that in some years of his 8 years in office, but he is not able to do it consistently, right? And the reason for that, guys, is a lot of when they tried to balance the budget, more so than it was, then we noticed, guys, that there are some subtle dips in the economy, right? But guys, here's the thing to keep in mind economically. Between 1950 and 1970, our economy, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as we transition, guys, was very, very strong. I mean, to my knowledge, I think this is still pretty much the case, guys, that 20-year period of time was the strongest 20 years of growth. If you look at the history of, really this, especially the modern American economy. All right. So it's a big deal. But what does it also mean, guys, when we say that he was conservative with money, but also liberal with human beings? The idea that we're gonna focus our attention on giving some support, right, to the idea of civil rights, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this is an interesting detail, guys, that we'll come back to when we study the civil rights movement, because Brown v. Board of Education, which if you don't know much about it, that was the case that overturned Plessy versus Ferguson formally. The one thing, guys, that you notice is that was actually within the first year and a couple of months of Eisenhower's first term. So he has a lot of, there's some criticism. Was he as outspoken about it as he should have been, et cetera, et cetera. But he does put his foot down, and he does eventually support the desegregation, or even some people would say integration, of Little Rock Central High School, which, by the way, is a few years later. Okay. All right. So that's kind of a big deal. Could he have done more? There's debate on that. But the idea of trying to support further, rights for people, et cetera, was something that you did see moving forward. Maybe not at a really fast pace in his time in office, but certainly the ideas are there. Okay. All right. So I want you guys to take a look at the picture here. So what do we notice, guys? Those of you that live in cities that are, maybe suburbs or whatever, that should make us think of what is called a suburb. These are popping up, continuously even now, but back then, the Levitt towns, as they became known as, guys. J. William Levitt, I believe his name was, guys, was in a position to actually, develop house building as almost like a science. And what do we notice about these houses? They're very similar. There's an expression they use called cookie cutter houses. And guys, what this guy was able to do. Now, Levittown, there's going to be a lot of them throughout parts of the country, but the original Levittown, I believe, was right outside of New York City, right? So they're building, guys, these houses they cannot get them up fast enough. Basically, guys, what a lot of suburbia, as it became known as, became associated with, or the burbs, as some people call it, was actually the rise of the 50s middle class in greater detail. Now, there's a downside of this, right? And we'll look at this later. But the idea, guys, of the downside is that, with the 1950s, all this, all these economic booms and things, you hear this term called affluent America thrown around. And guys, to a large extent, the suburbs were associated with affluent America. I once heard a story one time that was put like this. If you were to go up and you were to ask the typical, let's say middle school kid or even younger, or even probably high school to an extent, if you had access to one thing that really was absolutely vital to your life as a teenager in American history, then, what would it be? And guys, the answer was not your own car. I know that becomes a fixture later on, But to my knowledge, guys, the study illustrated it was actually, believe it or not, the typical bicycle. All right. So, guys, the idea of these kinds of communities reflecting, affluency, et cetera, is really important. But unfortunately, guys, this does not extend to all the walks of American life. Okay. So just something to keep in the back of our minds. What allows these to actually move forward, guys? This is heavily important to keep in mind. Eisenhower was a huge, huge proponent of what we call the highway system. The interstate, or also known as the National Highway Act, is exactly the way that it sounds. Guys, you are not going to have most likely the growth and the numbers certainly that we have moving outside the cities into suburbs unless you're going to have the development of the system. Now, for those of you that are familiar with this is obviously a pretty close to modern day depiction of the modern highway system. All right. There are continuing to be built roads like High 540 where I live in close to Raleigh, North Carolina, and that's still a big deal with kind of a what they call a belt or an inner loop or whatever. Okay, with the belt lines and things. But guys, for the most part, I want you to think: what is the benefit of this beyond only connecting cities and towns? Okay, and according to Eisenhower, guys, he goes in front of our Congress. He makes probably one of the, and there's a lot of his speeches that are good, but one of the ones that really convinces them to put, I mean, guys, you're talking billions of dollars that you're trying to convince the American Congress, right? In other words, the legislative branch to actually support. And so they eventually were like, yeah, but he uses a Cold War focus too, right? So guys, think about like this, the idea of the Cold War still being a very big fixture of American life with the second Red Scare that's still a possibility, at least in some people's minds. The idea of being able to land planes and have military vessels or vehicles, excuse me, if necessary, actually go from place to place because of these expanded roads and things. Those are all going to be things, guys, that we see that actually result from this modern highway system. All right. Every so often, I don't have a picture of this, guys, in here, but you can Google it if you want. If you type in like Eisenhower Interstate System, you'll see these bluish signs with stars that actually are around most highways, or some of them that actually say exactly that. Okay. Those of us that live in North Carolina, guys, if you don't, you can look at your own state. But since I live here, I figured I'd give my interpretation here. But you'll notice again a pretty well established highway system, guys. Highway 40, by the way, if you didn't know this, just a quick little fun fact. I'm going to say it starts around Wilmington because that's where I live in North Carolina. So therefore, I'm going to say Wilmington. But guys, if you go back to our previous map, all right, and it's kind of hard to see this with the distortion of the numbers. But you'll notice, guys, that Highway 40 is going to actually eventually go all the way out to Barstow, California, right? Not every highway, of course, is going to have that much terrain to it. But again, these highways, guys, very important. I mean, Highway 95, if you take a look here, goes to all the way pretty much to the top of Maine before you enter Canada. And it goes all the way, as you can see here, guys, down to pretty much Miami, Florida. All right. So these highways are big. I don't know if we always think about these guys in those terms, but Eisenhower is really a strong advocate of this and gets it done, right? So you got to give him a lot of credit there. Okay. At the end of the day, the question is, guys, what is his legacy? Is it only the highway? Is it the understanding that moving forward, even Republican presidents are going to have to basically adhere to some of the New Deal? I would say yes and yes to that. But guys, at the end of the day, his farewell address is going to be one of the most impactful, I think it's safe to say, in American presidential history. And the reason being, guys, is because he's passing the torch to John F. Kennedy. But a few days before he leaves office, he's giving this speech that essentially establishes what we call the really big importance of the military-industrial complex. Now, guys, I want you to think about what is there in front of you. A good basic working definition is here. It's where the military is linked to both corporate and scientific communities. Now, a lot of us that are thinking about this from this standpoint, okay, Mr. Baker, that's kind of a stuffy-headed definition. What really does that mean? Well, guys, first and foremost, think about the term itself. When I think of military, I think of Army, I think of Navy, I think of Air Force, I think of weapons, right? And guys, think about the idea of moving forward. We've got atomic weapons, we've got, atomic missiles, right? The idea of nuclear missiles and things like that. Okay. And when I think of corporate or industry, I think of companies, right? I think of industries that are actually developing these weapons. Kind of reminds me, for those of you that have seen the first, well, probably not the first, but anyway, the earlier 2000 Spider-Man, where you've got what is his name? Norman Osborn, who's the head of Oscorp, right? And he has this military contract, if my memory serves me correctly, and he's really upset. If we can't get this glider to work, we're going to lose tons of money and funding by the government and the military. Well, guys, believe it or not, a lot of you are like, well, Mr. Baker, that's a Marvel comic. Okay, that's a little far fetched, guys. That is a perfect example of how these kinds of communities are being impacted by government investment. And guys, what's the concern that Eisenhower has? We don't have time to watch this now, but you can watch his speech. It's on YouTube. And guys, he basically says that we need to be very mindful. Right now, this is kind of a paraphrase. And he also goes on to say that for Americans in our government, this is new, right? We're kind of we're not a fledgling nation as in we just started, but we are a superpower that has now assumed this great responsibility that does involve more of our economy being connected to the military production, right? So that's his concern, guys. And guys, keep in mind, he was an Army guy, he was a general. He obviously has a lot of opinions about this. He's kind of been there, done that before. So a lot of people, guys, really hear this and they're like, man, that's a pretty insightful way to leave office, right? I don't know if some people were surprised by it, but at the end of the day, it's like, okay, where do we go from here, right? Do we continue to really build up these arms, given that he was a big advocate of using, more nuclear power strength to kind of do, if you've ever heard of what's called brinkmanship, or, the idea of, you build up your nuclear weapons so much that you deter, right, another country, in this case, the Soviet Union, from wanting to have an exchange, right? Anyway, that's something to keep in mind. All right, guys, as always, it's been a pleasure. Next time we will transition to the 1960s and also the civil rights movement, as well as some of the 50s cultural, social, and economic trends. Feel free to email me if you have any questions. And otherwise, hope you're staying safe. And as always, have a good one. See you later. Bye-bye.